Hello and welcome to the first lesson on Buddhism, beliefs and teachings. Today we are going to be looking through the story of the Buddha, his teachings of the Four Noble Truths, as well as what he suggested were the three marks of existence, the three things that show that we exist in reality. So to start off with today, we need to understand who exactly was the Buddha. And we start off with Siddhartha Gautama. Now, Siddhartha Gautama was a prince who was born in a place called Lumbini, which is now in modern-day Nepal, was part of India. Now, he was born of Hindu origin. His father was the king. Now, the king, when he gave birth to a son, he asked a seer, someone who made prophecies about the future, this particular person called a Sita, who prophesied that effectively Siddhartha's future would either be that he was going to become a great king, which made the current king very happy, or a teacher of truths, which terrified his father. Now, the reason this terrified this father is because, well, if you go off and you abandon all of your riches, you've got no one to continue your family name. Also, religious leaders had a tendency to be persecuted, treated badly because of the people who disagree with their opinions. So to try and ensure that his son became a king, what his father did was remove all things that would cause any suffering to his son. This idea that if flowers started dying, they would get replaced. If servants got sick, they would get fired. No matter what it would be, any sign of suffering at all, the king would remove it completely from the palace. And we see here, this quote from the Buddha from the Pali Canon, clearly shows that, he had everything that he could have had, something for every season. At no point would Siddhartha Gautama be suffering. That was all up until he decided that he wanted to explore outside of the palace. Now, he had spent the first 27 years of his life living in the palace. And one day he decides to leave and he sees four things. The first thing he sees is an elderly person. He questions this and goes, well, why has he painted his hair white? Why is he moving so slowly? All of these sorts of typical characteristics that we know to be an old age person, he doesn't understand what it is. And then he discovers that, well, old age, it comes to us all. He then saw someone who was sick and in pain, and he questioned why it was they were making such awful noises, until he eventually discovered that this was sickness, and it was something that comes to everybody. And as a result of this, then, he saw somebody laying down in the streets, being carried through with his eyes closed. All the people around him were crying and screaming, and he questioned, how can someone sleep through all of this noise? How is it possible for someone to get any ounce of sleep at all? Until he realizes that this is what we call death, when life in this physical body ends and a new life begins. Now, he recognizes that all of the things that he saw in that day come to every single person, including the people he loved and cared about greatly. Now, because Siddhartha Gautama had not been desensitized to this concept of suffering because he had never experienced it before in his life, this was a lot for him to handle. Accepting the fact that his father was one day going to grow old and die. His wife would one day grow old and die. Even his unborn child would one day grow old and die. So whilst on a journey going back to the palace, he then comes across a holy man, someone wandering through the areas and just not settling anywhere. And this was somebody who lived a very basic life. He didn't have anything on him apart from the robes that he wore. And he said to Siddhartha Gautama, the only thing that you need to seek is the one thing that can never die. Now, all of a sudden, Siddhartha's ears spring up and he goes, well, hold on. I, of course, want to find something that isn't going to die, because he's obviously just discovered that everything in life will eventually die. And that terrifies him. And he discovers that this one thing then is truth. So in this moment then, Siddhartha Gautama decides that he is going to abandon everything that he owns, everything that he knows, and he is going to find truth. So, very quickly then, let's check our understanding so far. I've removed all four of the sites. Can you please just write down exactly what the four sites were? I'm going to reveal the answers in 3, 2, and 1. Okay, so there are the four sites. It was the old man, sickness, death, and a holy man. So in this moment then, he decides he's also going to become some sort of holy man. His father's plan had failed. Taking away all of this suffering meant that whilst he didn't realise it existed, he would stay. But the moment that Siddhartha realized that suffering comes in all sorts of forms and can impact everyone, there was no way he was going to stay in the palace any longer. So Siddhartha Gautama becomes what we know as an ascetic, someone who lives a really simple life with no possessions. In fact, he goes and he finds a place to meditate, and he lived off of only, depending on the stories you hear, 1 grain of rice or 3 sesame seeds a day. Now, he did this for a very long period of time. Over 6 years, he starved himself, but then in doing so, he recognized that actually this was no good, because all this was doing was causing more suffering. So he realized that actually some luxury is still required. Now, he suggested that luxury was bad because, well, you don't want to go out and actually do anything if you have luxury. If you imagine where you would rather be in school or at the beach with your friends, you're more likely to choose the more luxurious option, being at the beach with your friends. So if you have too much luxury, you're not going to want to learn anything new. You're going to want to chill out and relax. And he says that this is a terrible thing to do. In fact, he says you must follow what he refers to as the middle way, having a little bit of suffering and a little bit of luxury. So after 6 years, Siddhartha Gautama gives up his life of being an ascetic and decides that he's going to now start following this middle way. And when he does so, he sits under what we know as the Bodhi tree, and he meditates for a long period of time. In this period of time, a demon named Mara tries to distract Siddhartha Gautama from his meditation to stop him from being enlightened. Mara liked the fact that humanity was stuck in this wheel of samsara, this idea of constant birth, death, and rebirth. But Siddhartha Gautama managed to ignore all of these distractions and eventually become enlightened, having that higher state of knowledge. At this moment, then, he is no longer called Siddhartha Gautama. He is now referred to as the Buddha. If we were then to understand 2 beliefs about suffering from a 4-mark question, you would obviously want a point, explain, point, explain. Now, an easy way to do this is say, some suffering is good, or having a little bit of suffering is good. Explain why. Now, in day-to-day life, if you don't suffer at all, you're never really going to want to improve yourself as an individual. You're never going to want to learn new ways of doing things. Suffering is part of failure. If you fail, you're going to suffer from it, but you're going to motivate yourself to move forward. However, too much suffering is also bad, because you don't want to have that overshadow everything in your mind. Here's an answer that I wrote. Do feel free to copy it down, and then we will be moving on in 3, 2, and 1. So when he became enlightened, he wanted to teach other people how to do exactly what he did. And this is through the 4 noble truths. The first one is dukkha, and that purely means that all life is suffering. If you were to understand dukkha, suffering is a little bit of an interesting word to use. It's more linked to just being generally uncomfortable. Imagine going down a cobbled street on a bike with no suspension. You're going to feel every bump. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be there's going to be an element of suffering in there, but it's not in the sense of constantly being in pain and those really negative emotions. It doesn't have to be extreme at those ends, but the fact that there are times in life where things are going to be uncomfortable for you, that is what dukkha is referring to. Now, a lot of that dukkha is caused by samudaya, this idea that all suffering is caused by our desire for things. If you think about that brand new mobile phone that's just come out and all of your friends have got it and you don't, you suddenly feel, not as important, less cool, and that causes you to suffer. Or if there's other things that you really, really want that you can't get for whatever reason, a place you might want to go to, a family member you might want to see, but you can't get there, that can cause suffering. So a desire for things, a desire for stuff, a desire for people, that can cause suffering. But the third noble truth is this concept of nirodha, this idea that suffering, it is possible for that suffering to end. Now, I hear you ask, how? How can that possibly end? Now, we've already mentioned it. This concept of magga. Following the middle way is how you get rid of suffering. So through these 4 noble truths, as long as you can accept the fact that life is suffering and it's caused by those negative things, you are likely then to try and move away from those attachments, to move away from those desires, and that's going to allow you to reach magga, following that middle way, eventually getting to a point of reaching enlightenment. We then see here from this quotation from the Buddha himself, it says, "What I teach is suffering and the end of suffering." So he recognizes that not only is teaching about suffering and what causes it, but he also teaches this important idea as to how to get away from that. Now, he talks about suffering and these caused by desires. That is very much a mental suffering. It's not so much referring to physical suffering. However, physical suffering can be caused by your desires in a sense. For example, you see a chocolate cake and you just have to eat as much of it as you can, and then you feel sick. You know, you have that desire to demolish that entire cake, but at the end of the day, you're now regretting your life decisions. That's kind of what he's referring to. You can still feel physical pain from desires, however, it is harder to do so. It is more commonly linked to suffering of the mind, suffering of the emotions. That's more what he's referring to in these moments. Now we get on to finally looking at the 3 marks of existence. Now there are 3 main things that he said that we have to understand to truly understand what existence is. So we've got this idea of anicca. Everything constantly changes. Nothing is ever the same, which is very closely linked to that idea of anatta. There is no permanent self. In fact, the you that is sat watching this video right now is different from the you that was sat down starting video however many minutes ago. You are a different person than you were yesterday, from the day before, from the day before. I'm not just talking about in terms of your mental state, in terms of your emotions, but even your physical self. Your body is constantly dying and regenerating, cells dying and, remaking themselves to allow yourself to grow. But it's also accepting the fact that, yes, suffering is going to exist in life. So if you are suffering, if you are constantly changing and you recognize that there is no permanent self, you are going to recognize that existence is what you are stuck in. Now, the goal for the Buddhists is to escape from this existence because of this idea of dukkha. You don't want to exist in the real world. You want to exist outside of the 6 realms of samsara, and you want to reach enlightenment so that you can be in nirvana, a perfect place of peace and tranquility where your soul, which is referred to as your anatman. Now, your anatman is the permanent part of yourself. It's that spiritual entity that goes on and moves from life to life to life. Okay? So that is the bit that will go off to nirvana once it has escaped from existence. Now, the 12 mark questions in Buddhism are quite interesting because it gives you a lot of opportunity to evaluate language. Now, we see here the Buddha's teachings are more about the mind than the body, is the statement that we are looking at. Now, we have to make sure that we refer to Buddhist teachings. We need to give arguments both for and against, and we need to reach a justified conclusion. So what I have done is I have compiled together a table with some points, as well as a couple of quotations that you could use either side. So, in the agree side, saying that it's more about the mind rather than the body, is this idea of anatta, there not being a permanent self. If the Buddha was teaching about the body rather than the mind, we would focus a little bit more on the fact that maybe there could be a way to have a permanent self. But the fact that there isn't one, the fact that your body is constantly changing, the fact that you can't, stop any sort of forms of degeneration, it's not to do with what you can do with your body, because that's already set in stone. What you can control, however, is what goes on in your mind, which links in then to this idea of samudaya, is the fact that suffering is caused by desires. If you desire things, that's going to cause you to suffer. But desires purely exist in the mind, not necessarily within the body. And finally, then, this concept of asceticism. The removal of physical attachments allows you to focus your mind. This idea, by getting rid of the things that tempt you, by getting rid of the things that make it easy to slip out of your normal routines, or especially your extremely challenging routines, you're not going to be able to reach enlightenment. So asceticism shows you that actually control of the mind is crucial. Now, we could also link that in then to the Eightfold Path, which we're going to be talking about in the seminar, which is going to be coming up on May the 9th. So do make sure you listen out for that. But we get to this quotation at the bottom, what I teach is suffering and the end of suffering. This idea then that suffering exists in the mind, and you can end it by clearing your mind, by focusing the way that you live your life. It is all a mental battle with yourself almost. However, you do have this other side of the argument. The fact that there are certain physical things that happen that we can't stop or control. And that is something that we need to focus on. For example, old age can cause suffering. So it's all in good understanding that suffering exists, but if you can't if you can't stop those physical things that happen, it's also going to be about the body. You have to remove your attachments to your physical self rather than just removing your attachments mentally. In the same way that sickness can also cause suffering. It's a physical experience that you have that is going to cause you suffering in some way. Now, actually following the middle way requires physical luxuries. You can't get through life without eating food. And that is a physical thing that your body needs in order to be able to reach enlightenment. Because if your body is constantly suffering through starvation, you're going to find it really, really hard to focus your mind. And that's what Siddhartha Gautama himself discovered. Before he reached enlightenment, when he lived that ascetic lifestyle, he was starving. 6 years of nothing but 1 grain of rice or 3 sesame seeds a day. He was obviously going to be distracted by his stomach, the physical pain that he was experiencing. And when he was in the palace, none of this was the case. He was focused on those physical luxuries. You know, he was nurtured. He had all these beautiful ponds, these beautiful places, these mansions that he could go to. He avoided suffering through those ways. What I would like you guys to do is have a go at answering this question at home. If you want to send it in to me, for me to mark it and give you some feedback, please do feel free to do so. I know that the exams are coming around really, really quickly, so I want to be able to give as much support as I can. Thank you very much, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this little short session on Buddhism, and I will see you in the next one.